Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to talk in a little bit more depth about the Playback Engine dialog box. So let's get started. So you can see that there's no session open right now, but Pro Tools has loaded. So Pro Tools is on, and most options for me right now are grayed out. But there is one specific thing that we can get to before a session is open, and that's the Playback Engine. It's kind of a good thing that this is available before you actually open a session, because sometimes you want to make sure that you're choosing the right interface for the session you're about to open. So say that I switch to another interface, like the duet, and hit OK. Now if you do this when there's a session open, it will force you to close the session and reopen it. So this is definitely a good thing to check before you actually open a real session when Pro Tools loads up. So also in the Playback Engine dialog box, we have the hardware buffer size to deal with. So this is usually where you're going to go if you're having any troubles with your system performance. So if it's crashing, if you get an error during recording or playback, this is a good place to check. So what does the hardware buffer size actually deal with? It's for host-based processing, so it's sending 64 samples at a time to the computer's processor, and then in this case, right, 64 at this moment, to the computer's processor, which is the host, right? Host-based processing means the computer is doing some processing, and it's mainly for plugins and things that are being used during recording or during input monitoring. So this only affects tracks that are using what's called the low latency processing domain. So that's just tracks that are record enabled and tracks that are receiving live input and are therefore like being input monitored or something. So for instance, the hardware buffer is not being used in any way right now if I just play back. So none of this is an issue. So just playback does not affect the hardware buffer at all. What does is, say we're going to record a guitar track in here. Now this track that's record armed is now in the low latency domain. And that means every one of these plugins, this EQ, this compressor, this reverb, so this send out to this aux input track that's over here, velo delay, is also going to be now in the low latency domain because it's receiving a live send, right, from that guitar track over to this aux input track. So all these plugins now are also in the low latency domain. So the hardware buffer will affect all of these things that are happening, so that as the guitar player plays in, all those effects are sounding while you're recording. So most of the time you're going to limit the amount of plugins you have during recording so that you don't tax your computer's processor so much. So if you increase the buffer size, there's more latency when you're monitoring. So that means if your musician is playing this guitar track and they're having all this processing happen and then it's coming back out to their headphones, it may be delayed from what they actually feel in their hands. So they play their chord and then there's a tiny delay if the hardware buffer size is up too high, right? So if this is up too high, the musician starts having trouble lining up with what they're hearing because they play and then the actual audio they hear is coming back to them with a 512 sample delay, which is actually really tiny, but it's enough to cause problems. So that's monitoring latency. So they're actually, what they're hearing and what they're playing are too far apart, right? So they play and there's a delay and then they hear what they played. So that can really mess with your musicians as they're recording. So you want the lowest hardware buffer sizes you can get while recording, while avoiding any system crashes. So higher buffer size means more latency, and then lower means more chance that your computer is going to be taxed harder. So you want to get as low as you can get without crashes. So the main factors that affect the minimum hardware buffer size are, for one thing, how many tracks are record enabled, the number and type of plugins in use on a record enabled track. So not all these plugins are created equal in terms of processing needs, how greedy they are for processing. So time-based plugins like reverbs, echoes, and delays, those tax usually your system harder than, say, just an EQ. An EQ is not going to cause all that much trouble, right? So certain ones are going to tax your system more than others. So that's why the number of plugins matters, but also the type of plugin. And time-based plugins like reverbs and delays are going to cause harder workload for your system. Then if you have a lot of virtual instruments in your session, depending on your settings, they may also be operating in the low latency domain, and again affecting what your minimum buffer size needs to be. So we'll talk more about that later as far as the settings for those virtual instruments. And then finally, the number of native plugins being used on aux input tracks if they're receiving audio. So that was this case, right? I hit record on or input monitor the guitar track, and that means all these plugins are now in the low latency domain, but so is this aux input track that's got a delay on it and an EQ and then a compressor, because they're processing that audio that's coming in during recording. So any aux input with plugins on it that's having live audio sent to it via input monitoring or record enabling will also tax your system harder. Cool, let's look at a couple other things in that Playback Engine. So here's that dialog again, and we got a couple other things in here. So host engine options. First one is optimize performance at low buffer sizes. So we can just kind of assume that that's what we want. It's probably Pro Tools is just going to do some algorithmic things that help us. So I would generally have that checked. Then we have ignore errors during playback and record. So these errors are just about what you're hearing during playback and record. So say that you're playing something back and there's a little issue with your system, a little lag or some issue that happens. You might hear a little click or a pop out of the headphones or out of your monitor speakers. So it's just what's being played back to you. So what's actually being recorded may not have any clicks or pops in it. So you can pretty safely choose ignore errors during playback or record, and you may hear a click or a pop here and there, but it's not going to stop. It's not going to bring your whole recording session to a stop because you heard some little click out the monitor speakers or a little pop out the headphones that the musician's recording on. So one thing to know about that ignoring errors during playback and record, if you're bouncing your mix and you don't choose offline, so you're going to do a live bounce, which means you're going to play back that whole thing in real time, and that's going to write, say, a WAV file. So if we have the ignore errors during playback and record checked during that final print to bounce to disk, if there are clicks and pops then, it will be on your final mix because it's playing back, right? It's playing back in order to write onto your WAV file. So you do want this unchecked if you're bouncing in real time. But if you're using offline bounce, you're safe anyway. And then dynamic plugin processing, again, Pro Tools is going to do some cool algorithmic stuff that's going to help reduce the load on your system processor when it's having to deal with a lot of plugins during recording or input monitoring. Okay, so cache size. So this is mainly useful when you're using shared media storage. So that's like a studio that's got two sessions going at once, and both of those sessions might be using the same hard drive to store the audio. So they're going to be fighting a little bit for that hard drive's information, right? So this is mainly for playback. It's not usually going to cause you issues during recording. Usually the hardware buffer is where you have to look during recording. Cache size is more about just playing back, or if you're using a shared hard drive between multiple sessions that are being run, say, simultaneously. So you're pretty safe to just keep it on the normal setting. So the normal setting is designed to optimize disk space by growing the cache size, the amount of RAM it's taking, depending on how many tracks you have. So if you have a whole lot of tracks that are going to need to play back at once, you're going to have a larger cache, and that's automatically going to be calculated when this cache size is set to normal. Now you can choose a certain amount of RAM to actually just dedicate to playback, but generally that's not that important. And if you take up a ton of the RAM, that RAM is then not going to be available to other things that Pro Tools might need it for. So unless you're using a shared hard drive between multiple Pro Tools sessions, you probably should just leave this on normal. You're pretty safe to just leave it alone. Typically, when you're opening up the Playback Engine, there's two main things you look at. You're going to look at what your current interface is, and you're going to look at your hardware buffer size. I very rarely worry about anything else there. So there is one other quick thing I want to look at under this setup menu, and that is hardware. So the hardware dialog will look more or less like this, and it will have a button for Launch Setup App. Now that app button, its action will be different depending on your interface. This is interface specific. So right now I'm using my Apollo Twin, so if I launch the setup app, what it actually launches is the console for the Apollo, right? So that it's whatever native software might come with your particular interface. So in this case, it's this UAD Thunderbolt, right? There's not a whole lot we can talk about here because everybody's setup app is going to be somewhat different, but you can always launch your interface's setup app to make adjustments right from this setup window and then launch setup app. And that's pretty much it. So you should be more or less set for the Playback Engine and hardware. I would go play in that hardware dialog a little bit just to see what's in there for your particular interface. But most likely you've had whatever the setup app for your interface is open at some point anyway, because if you've recorded, usually you're using your interface's software, not Pro Tools, to do various changes of input volume and things like that. Okay, so that's about it for that one. I will see you in the next one.